technically, theoretically. We may not be actually on. Yeah, last Sunday we didn't. It didn't actually go out, even though it looked at this end like it was going out.
My phone just told me Justin just went live.
Oh, well, that's a good sign, eh?
Yeah, I noticed, Peter, in that setting that where I used to get blissed out, I don't anymore, which I think is a good thing. You know, even though I'm doing.
Well, you aren't falling.
stuff.
You aren't falling for the
Yeah.
the glitz.
But it's no more or less of an opportunity to notice
Oh, absolutely.
things than any
totally.
other circumstance.
Totally.
You know.
I mean, chanting is, chanting can be a great yoga, and all these things are great yogas.
Mm-hmm.
But the trick is to, use them as vehicles for actual noticing, which is where the yoga happens, rather than just, getting addicted to it as a high.
Yeah.
It's the problem with devotion. It can be seductive, because we have such a psychological bias in our infantile portions of our psychology to want to find mommy and daddy to love us forever and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And if you key into that thing unconsciously, that pattern, then you can get caught up in a little vortex. It's sort of self-fulfilling prophecies. Mm-hmm. It can be tricky.
We had an opera at club tonight, and
Could you talk up a little bit?
we had an opera that we just came from, and there were moments of just sheer beauty that I noticed. I don't know what to call it, but I guess I think it's the same thing. I noticed that it's the same feeling that I get in satsang. Or, people call it chills, but that's actually also isn't that what is referred to as Shakti?
Well, it is. Everything is Shakti, but when you see the everything a little bit more, when you see the sort of a bigger picture, it's inherently kind of thrilling, satisfying, exciting, bliss producing. And so it's like when you see a beautiful sunset or a great work of art. Why is a beautiful sunset beautiful? What makes beauty? It's just a pattern of colors and light, just like this is a pattern of colors and light. But something about that, in the way it is perceived, somehow keys the perceiver into a subtler aspect or a bigger picture of their own nature, their own situation, which is, that opening is inherently blissful and satisfying and beautiful and so on and so forth. It's essentially, it is literally spiritual discovery. It's spiritual noticing, whether it's taken to be that in those formal terms or not.
But when I really looked at it, it seemed as if it was an electrical change in the body. It was an electrical sensation.
Well, you've heard me talk about how we hold ourselves in relationship to our energy. And this is what that is. When that shifts, you feel it as called electrical. We feel it as an energy. We hold like in I don't know. I'm completely out of my depth here, but just to bullshit a little bit. I know in Reiki and theory they have this idea that you're sort of this orgone armoring where we sort of basically tighten up habitually in terms of our own energy, our own biological energies or psychic energies or whatever. And the goal of Reiki and therapy is to loosen that armoring, to get a free flow. And I wouldn't disagree with that. I think although I would say it's less of necessarily a psychological issue per se than as the kind of metaphor we use as a spiritual issue of the way we approach the reality of our being we typically do it from within a relatively or partially or to some degree constricted stance. There's some degree of holding or positioning, or again, we don't really have precise language for this. And these kinds of moments, these kind of aha moments, are moments where there's releases of that to some degree or in some way, and to for some duration or whatever. So I mean, all this stuff is inherent. Spiritual revelation is inherent. It's just a discovery of what you already are. It's not like you're getting something from someone else. But it feels like revelation because we typically aren't aware of what we already are. We don't give ourselves full access to that. And so when we see that, it's like, wow, gosh, this is incredible. And it is incredible. It's truly incredible.
I can see how you can pattern your life to make that more apparent and more frequent, and to actually live in that.
Yeah. Well, this is what we're playing with here. This is what we're trying to address. Is to discover ways of accessing the fullness of this being more deeply, more fully, more often, more whatever.
So, immersing yourself in that is better than not. Or
well, it's healing. It's entire. It's your full being. It is the goal of evolution. It is there's various different kinds of ways of approaching it. It's psychological maturity, it's spiritual maturity. All these things come with. But fundamentally, it has to do with how we are relating to our own experience, how we hold ourselves with regard to our experience. And this holding keeps us from noticing the fullness of what our experience actually is, which is ultimately this astounding multidimensional free flow of energy. But it's interesting, we were talking earlier about these different chanting and devotion to gurus and these various aspects of people that are trying to approach this whole thing. And it's a really subtle, slippery slope. It's very easy to mistake the means for the end. It's very easy to find a technique that gives you some opening and just, drones out for it and just become completely addicted to it. Like people that, we see this in people in lifestyle all the time. People that become, drug addicts or drinking obviously is in that direction, but people who have, who are very heavily into rock shows or something, or people who are sports fans, all of these techniques, let alone more explicitly spiritual things like chanting and devotion and yogas and so on and so forth. All these techniques are all about, opening to some degree to this rush of energy that we inherently are. But typically the problem is to make the mistake that the energy is coming from the activity or from the vehicle, the thing you're doing. Instead of discovering, you're just discovering your own nature. which of course is the case.
Well, and in many cases they wish you to do that, don't they, in order to get you embedded in the organization?
Well, totally.
Or,
well, absolutely.
I mean,
a lot of it.
There are a lot of dishes to do, and
totally. A lot of it is unintentionally self-serving, and a lot of it is much more contrivedly self-serving. And these sort of organizations or these, religions and what all. It's good to have followers. You have followers, you have cash flow, you have ego hands, you have all of this stuff, and all of a sudden you have all sorts of people participating, and this whole thing snowballs, and that seems to be, that everyone involved thinks that's a good thing. And all of a sudden it stops having anything to do with self-discovery and more to do with a social enterprise that has, sort of stimulating aspect. It's difficult to teach naked spirituality. I mean, I that's kind of what I aspire to, and so I as you may notice, I don't tend to have pet practices or techniques or do this or do that or different pet ways of designating what the goal is. Like it's light or it's God or it's this or it's that, because it's what it is, and it's so easy to mistake the designation for the thing. If you say it's peace, then you're feeling peaceful, and you go, oh, I'm getting it. That's it. It's peace. I'm there. That's it. Well, it's it's not that it's not peace, but it's not peace. It's this. This is a nice way to designate it because it doesn't have a whole lot of conceptual baggage attached to it, and it's totally open-ended. It's completely inclusive. I mean, it's hard to make a slogan or a buzzword out of this. Where do you look?
How to get photographs for sale.
Yeah. But it's tricky. It's an interesting challenge. It's an interesting proposition.
Well, recently I've been actively going back to that place because it feels so good, and I wanted to explore it. And
which place in particular?
Fix.
Well, I've been doing that too. Once a week.
Just feeling incredibly good.
Sure.
And that happens in satsang. Well, I noticed it, it happened in the opera, and I was looking at, I said, oh my God, that's kind of the same thing.
Good. It's great to notice that. It's a good observation.
But I've been intentionally, really exploring that, and trying to see if that goes somewhere, or if that's just a place to just hang out.
Yeah. I mean, this whole, just the way you put it, is illustrative of another, challenge of this whole process is because the spiritual opening, or let's just say, words. Let's say, opening to a fuller flow or presence of the energy that you actually are. Let's call it that. Has sort of side effects. It has side effects of sort of bliss or joy. It has side effects of happiness. It has side effects of sort of spacing out. Like a high kind of thing, and these various other things. And again, it can be very easy and tricky to mistake the side effects for the thing itself, and then you go chasing the side effects rather than the actual phenomena. But the side effects are there too. So ultimately it's a question of exposure and maturity, of being with it, so you can learn to discriminate and see what's what. But and so what you're saying sounds very good to me, because to be with this, with a certain amount of skepticism, or at least a certain amount of inquiry, rather than just, oh yeah, that's it, I've got it, now this is great, I'm starting to feel good, kind of thing. To begin to see what's really going on there.
Well, it's like, there's a lot of worrying that, this could be a trap, that I should...
Well, you don't need to worry. You don't need to worry,
but
the trick, Sure. But the trick is to, always be a little skeptical. Don't be eager to jump on a bandwagon of something real quick and say, oh yeah, this is it, kind of thing. Be a little skeptical of saying, well, this is here and it's really interesting, isn't it? Let me see what's going on. Let me see what else is here. And that's, and then you can develop a more sophisticated, a more subtle, a more mature relationship to the condition, and really begin to see what's actually happening a little better.
So basically, would you call it like it feels like opening?
Yeah, sure.
It's like
opening is good.
Open.
Yeah. Opening is a good metaphor.
For me, it also seems like an ability to really be present and focus on a task at hand,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's playing a football game or writing or whatever it
Sure.
might be.
Sure.
That a lot of junk gets cleared out, and there's less distraction, maybe.
Yeah. As we develop a more open relationship with our energy, that energy becomes more functional, more directly present and available for function, for behavior, for action. For sure, yeah.
Focusing on the heart also produces another kind of opening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all kinds of things. I mean, you can focus on the chakras. Each of the various chakras, if you focus on it, will produce a different kind of a quality. Or focusing on other kinds of things. Focusing on light, focusing on sound, whatever. And each of those will be distinct and will be different from other kinds of focusings. And they're all revealing aspects of the same thing. That's part of the reason why this is so tricky to get at, because it's infinite. It's so multidimensional. It's so easy to get a piece of it and think that's it, and that is it. But that's not it exclusively. That's not all of it. That's not the whole thing.
Is it actually without any kind of conditions?
Yes, without any conditions whatsoever, and yet paradoxically, it generates all conditions.
So it's actually stripped down to just being.
Well, it's not stripped because it's not reduced. Nothing is taken away from it. But this is it's absolutely pure, it's absolutely complete, it's absolutely entire, it's absolutely full, it's absolutely radiant, it's absolutely, but it's absolutely primal as well. It's absolutely primal. And that primacy generates all secondary aspects, like a fireworks show, like a sparkler. Sometimes I talk about a sparkler. It's just so that primacy, that little fire in the center, just generates everything. And so all of these qualities are that raw, essential fact.
Fact of it happening.
Yeah, the only fact. It's the only fact there is. All so-called other facts are just aspects of the one fact. Call it being, called divine call. But again, the more you name it and the more you designate it, the more you're liable to be indicating a partial aspect of it.
Yeah. So when somebody says, what's happening, they're actually talking about this.
Sure. I know. Anytime anyone ever says anything, they're talking about this. There's nothing else to talk about. Literally.
Isn't this the fact that it's this, though? It's not.
It's absolutely the fact that it's this. But not in any limited way. That fact is inclusive. But it's the only fact. It's what is. That's how Pino used to refer to it. I didn't know what he was talking about. Because he wouldn't be talking in any kind of teaching context or anything. He'd be talking about something or other and say, but what is? And then he'd go on. And I thought he was just like, well, what is, like, what's the case, the circumstances. But then I'm like, what is? Oh! What is?
Okay, so this is where this is all clearly the truth, what we're talking about. It's almost laughably obvious.
I'm not.
Right? But there's this shift within experience where I asked the same thing last time. We're talking about severing, dismembering me, and saying, okay, if I were to cut off your arm, your beingness would still be intact.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not. You were trying to illustrate that I'm not my form inherently. And that's true. But what if you cut off my head?
Mm-hmm. Let's try and find out.
That's a risky.
Do you have a big knife, Susan?
Okay, creepy cult. I'm out
It's
here.
that baby coming out.
That's next week.
So I mean,
Cut off someone else's head.
I'll go.
you're up. Okay.
But this is a very good question. I mean, basically, you're asking what happens when you die.
But I don't care.
No, it's not a matter of caring particularly, but it's illustrative of the problem, right?
Yes. It isn't a desire to. Is the ego structure going to survive? Am I going to heaven? Am I going to hell? That's not the point, though. That question or that concept that I was bringing up about the body arises only because I don't understand how there can be certainty that the consciousness that experiences everything here is the same as yours, in a manner of speaking. That there's only one consciousness experiencing everything that is itself. I don't know how that could possibly be known.
Well, you know it directly by the fact of your experience. I mean, look at your experience. There's one consciousness that experiences everything.
Yes. And I
Simple
understand
fact.
and all the dreaming analogies and everything checks out, except there's no way, there's still no way for me to not. I asked this last time, and I'm feeling this experience,
Right.
and my consciousness doesn't discriminate between this rubbing of my fingers and that flower over there.
Right.
It sees them both directly, immediately, like you say. But this feels more than the flower, right? In other words, I'm not feeling from within the flower as much as this.
Oh yeah. Well, but this is the quirks. Well, you are talking about embodiment, and this is very interesting, which is more about the geometry of the energy spectrum of experience than anything else. For example, the field. I wish I had a big chalkboard here.
Yeah, and a pointer.
If you want to sort of do a schematic of the topography or the geometry of the energy spectrum of experience, if the field of vision is say a fuzzy ovoid like this, right? Okay, the field of sound might look like a funny figure eight shape like this, the field of smell well, it's hard to know what shape that would be, but it might be a kind of a, fuzzy balloon somewhere around here, say, or whatever. I mean, and this is just just a thought experiment, and so on and so forth. Now, the field of touch, what shape is it? Well, you can't cheat by using your eyes to say what shape your body is. What shape does your field of touch say your body is? And again, you end up with a sort of a fuzzy blob with, sort of a lot of ins and outs and dimensions and texture and all of that. And so, and then what shape is the mind? And the mind might look like let's say, a parabola up here, just sort of open-ended forever. Let's arbitrarily say. So you have these different geometries, and this is the sort of the shape of the energy of your embodied, let's say your embodied aspect of the energy of your experience. Now, you can't, so when you see those flowers, you're talking about something within the vision field. When you feel your fingers, you're talking about something within the sensation field. These fields are complete and entire in themselves. In other words, the sensation field feels all the sensation that you feel, period. It's complete, just like the field of vision contains all the vision you see, period.
Are they discrete?
Huh?
Are they discrete?
No, they're not discrete, but they are distinct. So that you can see the Andromeda Galaxy, but you can't touch the Andromeda Galaxy. Because the Andromeda Galaxy exists in your field of vision, it doesn't, in that portion of your experience, it doesn't exist in the portion of your experience of touch. Now, when it gets interesting is where there's an overlap. And you can smell, a car driving by, or whatever, you can smell garbage. And you can see garbage, but you can't really hear garbage. So in other words, there's an overlap of energies that appear, specific focused aspects of energies that seem to be appearing in these different portions of the geometry. But they don't necessarily have a correlation one to another, or a correlation to another area of the geometry where they're not appearing. So just the fact that, in other words, the fact that you can feel your fingers, but you can't feel those flowers from over there, doesn't mean anything. It just means that your vision functions different. The energy that shows up as vision is a different presentation than the energy that shows up as sensation. I don't know that I put that very well.
No, that makes
sense. But you can explore it and play with it, so that it's a peculiarity that our energy does have this kinds of geometry to it, as in terms of embodiment, in terms of how it seems to be showing up, and it's interesting that it should be so. But and it's observable that it is so. But the implication is sort of open-ended. That's the shape of things. It's like, why are stars roughly spherical? Well, that's the shape of things. That's how the energy seems to be working in that context. So, and the energy of a human embodiment seems to have this kind of a geometry, roughly. And then where it gets really interesting is starting to look at, well, what is it that's showing up in this context? What is we're talking about energy geometry, okay, fine. We've been talking about the geometry more. Now we can look at what about the energy part of that more. And then we find the ways in which it begins to correlate and tie together. The geometry is sort of the ways in which it's different. But then when you start looking at the energy, you start finding the ways in which it's the same, and you discover that in actuality, vision is a very similar energy to sensation, experientially, if you look very closely at what the energy that presents itself. Even though superficially, or without giving it a lot of attention, They seem very, very different, but when you look at what light is, this sparkling presence, and then you experience what touch is, it's, lo and behold, it's a sparkling presence too. It's different, it has a different kind of quality, but it's a different part of the spectrum, let's say, we might say. Just like red is different than green, because it's a different part of the spectrum. But they're both light, and so likewise, when we begin to look at the energy itself, rather than focusing on the ways in which it's different in terms of this geometry, start looking at the ways in which it's the same, you get a lot of mileage out of that. Because when we start to become more familiar with the energy itself and its naked form, we discover that the energy is not limited to these embodied geometries. We discover there's energy outside of the five senses and mind that is also present in experience.
It just all seems to point to no matter how removed or disidentified with ego or the smaller structure of self, it still seems to relate to a bigger self, which is discrete and separate from Peter Brown.
Oh yeah, well it is discrete, but it is discrete and separate from Peter Brown. Peter Brown doesn't exist in your universe.
All right, what's that about?
Well, it's very strange. Is what it's about. I mean, this is this fantasy of objectivity. Objectivity is a notion which occurs subjectively. In other words, it takes a subject to have the idea of objective existence. It takes you to suppose that there's a me that exists. It takes me to suppose that there's a you that exists. So my supposing that you exist is all about me. Or I might suppose you don't exist, and that's also all about me. So, in other words, typically we're so, what's the word? Well, I'll just use a really stupid word. We're so brainwashed into belief in objective reality and the physical world and the physical universe, and that we're small pieces in this vast machinery, that we don't even question it. And yet, everything whatsoever appears in, if you go to empirical evidence, if you suspend that, if you can hold that as, okay, that's a hypothesis, it's a possibility. If you can hold it as a possibility rather than just an absolute certainty of, well, of course, the objective world exists. What are you, nuts? If you can get beyond that and just say, okay, there's one hypothesis, one theory, there's an objective world. Let me see what the evidence of that is, empirically. Let me look at my experience. Because the one fact that is undeniable is my experience. My experience exists. Not what it is, whether it's objective or subjective, even whether I'm having it. All those spin doctory subsequent notions aren't really the point. The point is, the fundamental fact is not the existence of an external world. The fundamental fact is the existence of my experience.
Yeah.
So, in that context, what can I verify? And I start looking around, and I start looking around, and I start looking around, and the buck kind of stops there. It's hard to get beyond that is the fundamental fact. And then what conclusions can I draw in the context of that fundamental fact? Well, everything else is, relatively, everything else, all elaborations, are hypotheses, they're possibilities. They may be, they're interesting possibilities. It may be that there's an objective world. How can I know that? Which is another way of saying, how can I know that this isn't an incredibly elaborate, incredibly detailed dream? Can I prove it's not? I can't. So that's another hypothesis. This is an incredibly elaborate and detailed dream, or something analogous to that. Or it's an objectively existing physical reality, Or this whole thing all of my experience is actually the readout of a computer simulation being done in some alien species in some alien universe. The hypothesis. Can I disprove it? No. But none of that touches the fundamental primary fact that my experience exists. Whatever it is, it exists. It is. Now, so my experience exists. I know this. It's self-evident. It's the only thing that's self-evident. In that context, does your experience exist? I can't say any more than I can say whether or not the world exists. It's an objective thing. It may. You may well be an experiencing entity like me, or you may be a figment of my imagination. And I cannot know the difference. I cannot prove the difference. But I can look at what you actually are, and when I do that, I look at what I actually am, and I discover this astounding presence of an amazing multidimensional energy in let's say, I mean, to be sort of, just to use a very sloppy description, in a sort of an astounding consciousness. And that I can find, that's present. And as soon as I start saying what the energy is or what the consciousness is, I'm back into the same thing of just putting out hypotheses. But it's present, and I can know this. So I can know the energy that you are, and when I look at the energy I am, and I look at the energy you are, it's the same energy. So if you're a figment of my imagination, I'm a figment of my imagination just as much as a human being.
Yeah.
Do you follow that?
Yeah, I do. I do.
We have a question from the internet,
Oh, really?
which is, how can things be known to the self, to be self-evident, when the self isn't absolutely known?
Well, again, let's say the self isn't absolutely known. What is absolutely known? What's absolutely known is what we've been talking about, which is, the fact of the existence of your experience, or in this case, my experience, of course. In this case, you is me. So, if there is a knower, it consists of that fact, because since that fact is a certainty, then anything that exists will boil down to that fact, right? In other words, if this experiencing exists and is the only thing that exists, then anything else that exists will be that. So if there's a me, it must be this experiencing. If there's a self, it must be this experiencing. If there's a world, it must be this experiencing. If there's you, it must be this experiencing. So it's self-evident, not to a self in a sense, in a logical sense, that there's a self and there's an it and there's a two relationship. It's not like that. This is just a sloppy, semantic way of trying to say there is a fact. There's actually something knowable. There's a fact. It's not like everything is up for grabs. There's a fact, and the fact is the existence of this experience. Whatever existence turns out to be, or whatever experience turns out to be, that's the fact, that the being of this experience is. And in that sense, it's self-evident. In the sense that the being of this experience is obvious to the being of this experience. I mean, it starts to sound like gobbledygook when you talk about it.
So you gave us some geometry for the 5 senses, 5 physical senses.
Well, 6 senses, including the mind.
Okay, but then
Arbitrarily.
yeah,
I gave you a version of a geometry.
a
possible geometry.
So what would a possible geometry look like of the spiritual, the next dimension out, so to speak?
Well, it stops having geometry at that point. The notion of geometry stops being applicable. Because you enter into infinities, and the geometry of infinity is beyond my limited means of expression. I mean, an interesting aspect in terms of theory of incarnation I mean, one theory is that, you know, this embodiment actually is a sort of a functioning system in its own way, and when it dies, a large aspect of its functionality actually ceases, which is not an unreasonable hypothesis. And so what does that look like in terms of our present experience? The way I inquire into that kind of an issue is I look at my sensory experience, which is clearly related to a physical embodiment, if there is one, I mean, according to this hypothesis. So I see light because the eyes see light. You know, I hear sound because the ears hear sound. I feel because the body has nerve, you know, sensation nerves and blah blah blah, which accounts for this geometry and accounts for the texture of those energies too. So light looks like light because of the way the eyes work. Sound looks like let's say, experiences like as sound with the texture of sound because of the way the ears work, and so on and so forth. And all of it, of course, because of the way the brain works. So is there any, right at this moment, is there any extra physical experience happening? In other words, can I find in my own experience that is not specifically body related? And for me the answer is yes. I discovered, for example, in my thought processes, it's quite clear to me, it's very obvious. I can tell when my brain is thinking, because I think like a human. I think in thoughts. It's time related. There's a blooming of processes like this. It's sort of causal. But I have another intelligence, which I usually call it inherent intelligence or something, which I have complete access to, which is completely nonlinear. It's outside of time. It's instantaneous. It's independent of my physical condition. When I get drunk, my human mind starts functioning less well. The inherent intelligence doesn't. It's always completely lucid. It's always bang, always 100%. And in my experience, it's quite evident to me that this is not a product of the functioning of my body. Yet it is in my experience. So this to me is immediate evidence that my bodily experience shows up in a non-body based experience, call it experience. And to me this is quite self-evident. I've explored this in great depth. And I use the example of mentality just as to me it's a particularly obvious one, but there's all sorts of other ways that if you start to investigate your sensory experience, you'll discover that when you reach the edge of your senses, your experience doesn't stop. The quality changes drastically. So, but it's not a nothing. It's definitely not a nothing. In fact, what's there has astounding properties that are way superhuman relatively in terms of the let's say the efficiency or the speed or the bandwidth of the sort of the body-based experience. I mean, body-based experience has a sort of a graininess. It has a sort of a degree of sluggishness, a degree of inefficiency. I mean, it's obviously like vision and light and all. It's obviously incredibly high frequency, incredibly fast, and so on. And yet, there's something that's much, much, much faster that is within my direct experience. It's subtle, so I have to be. I have developed the ability to notice it because I am it. So I can notice it because I can go there. I can go to super physical functioning because it's present, and it's quite distinct from physical modes of energy, you might say. But they turn out to be the same thing. Physical modes of experience turn out to be kind of a stepped down or a slowed down version of superphysical modes.
But they're actually a subset of it, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of like a bush growing on a hill is a subset of the biosphere of the hill. The bush wouldn't be there without the hill. So the bush is actually an outgrowth of the hill. or all plant life is an outgrowth of the biosphere. But like your hair is an outgrowth of your head. The hair wouldn't be there without the head. The bush wouldn't be there without the hill. And the body, the entire embodiment wouldn't be there without this field that it is a condensation of, or exists in the context of. But and all of this is kind of admittedly theoretical and hypothetical. But the fact remains that if you do investigate your experience very subtly and precisely, I think you can find what I'm talking about and notice these very, very fine, very, very astounding aspects of energies that are showing up in experience that are really outside the context of anything that's relatable as physical.
Yeah.
Do you have?
Exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
Being a messenger here, not.
Oh yeah.
There's somebody asking, are you actually having two thoughts at exactly the same time?
Well, thoughts are discrete and they aren't numbered, so you can't say just having two thoughts. I'm having an infinite number of thoughts at the same time, but they aren't thoughts because they aren't separate chunks of individual things. It's like saying, am I seeing more than one light at the same time? Well, yeah, I'm seeing infinite photons or flashes or whatever. So, but they aren't discrete necessarily. It's a field. So,
but it is actually. The knowing is not part of the process that the mind is going through.
Right. Yeah. The knowing is superphysical.
That's right.
Knowing is superphysical. What's knowing your experience is not in your body, and it is not in your brain.
And it's not a thought.
And it's not thought. It's instantaneous. Well, it's you can say it's awareness, but it's more and less than that. It has actual aspects that are directly knowable. Like it has this hyper intelligence. It exists beyond time, so it's not a linear processor. It's just instantaneous holographic knowing.
And there's also what I'm just getting more and more aware of is that you can know chaos.
Oh yeah. And
I never knew. I mean, for me, when I first saw chaos, I thought overwhelming.
Yeah.
But it is overwhelming. It is awesome, but it's also knowable.
Yeah, totally.
And that is different from thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, everything is knowable. There's nothing that's not knowable. This is the astounding fact. Because what knows it is identical to being itself, and nothing exists outside of being. And whether you say is it my being or is it the universe's being, these kind of distinctions again fall apart on the theory. There's the fact of being. Being is undeniable fact, and that fact is absolutely inclusive. There's nothing outside it. And if you go looking for it, you'll find you are nothing but this being. So you are everything. And again, this is directly knowable. This is a self-evident fact. If you go looking for yourself, okay, who am I? And you do pursue an honest inquiry, you're gonna finally get to, well, there's being here. That's absolutely unassailable fact. And so if there's a me, it must be this being. Because this being is the fact, and so anything that is has to be that fact. If I exist at all, if that's even meaningful to talk about a me or an I or a self or anything, it has to be the being, because the being is the unassailable fact. The being is what is. Again, these things are, we may be pushing language to try and put these things in kind
it is pushing language because the knowing has no ifs.
Yeah.
The language has lots of ifs.
Yeah. It doesn't translate one to one. Right. But hopefully if we're artful enough, we can be semi-useful anyway.
Peter, when you just, sometimes at night I'm just like looking at my mind or looking at what's going on, and I see thoughts come up and then thoughts go away, and then usually I just see a flow and thoughts come in occasionally, but there's just sort of like, zzz, like something's on.
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about as far as something being outside?
Well, you have to look and see. It can be both and.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, what's outside and what is more physical functioning they're aspects of the same thing. So it's not an either or.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, when you go to sleep, there's still experience of bodily functioning. There's still, the fuzz of neurons firing and that kind of thing. Although they're relatively indistinct by comparison to our waking functioning.
Right.
But that exists in the context of this hyperintelligence and this awareness and this beingness.
Yeah, right. I mean,
and the being doesn't, and the proof of that is when you go to sleep, you don't cease existing. It's not like you go to sleep and then you wake up and it's like you feel like you were just created and you don't know. There's a subtle sense of continuity of, well, I was out of it, but somehow, there was being there, and now the being looks like this, and now I'm functioning in it, intelligently or not, and so on and so forth. But it's not like all of a sudden this just came into existence out of absolute nothing. It's not like there was non-existence. There's a sense of, well, yeah, but there was existence, even if I don't know what it was. And so again, this is the background, It's very hard to put this in words, but explore your own experience. Look for clarity. Look for like an inherent primary clarity. Clarity is not a phenomena of physical manufacture. The brain cannot manufacture clarity. And yet all experience exists in an inconceivably pure, absolute clarity that's invariable.
Right.
So that clarity is not a byproduct of brain function. On the contrary, it's the context within which brain functioning appears. And so on and so forth. And similar, qualities of clarity, quality of awareness. Look for what's experiencing your experience right now.
Right.
And it's not a thought. Thoughts are objects of experience. What's experiencing thought? You start saying, well, mind is, or I am, and you start sort of grappling for these notions. But then you look for what those notions are, and they're just notions. And as notions, they're objects of experience. What's experiencing them?
It's almost like reality transcends itself.
Yes.
Every second as it's happening.
Yes, exactly.
As soon as it sees itself, it's already
Yeah.
not it.
Yeah.
But it's always there anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. One way I put that is that it spits off versions of itself. Like it spits off virtual reality. An image I use a lot is a sparkler that's just constantly just shooting out, unendingly shooting out these sparks. And you look at a spark, you see all the sparks flying out. Your tendency is to follow the sparks, but actually, of course, where the action is, it's that center where it's coming from. And likewise with this, all of these, when we try and look at this astounding phenomena, it's so easy to go to the versions that are they're here, they're accessible. You can get a hold of them, you can address them, they present themselves. But when you start getting into, well, where's it coming from? What's experiencing it? What's really going on? The closer you get to the core, the weirder it gets, and the harder to get a handle on it. And then you tend to, it's a seduction to go to the versions because they're more obvious. They're less tricky. Although when you look at them closely, they turn out to be just as tricky. I mean, that's a very good trick. Is to go to what when like for an example, you're doing inquiry and trying to figure out what's experiencing my experience, and it just gets too weird, and you just can't find. It's like, wow, that question is just too deep. But I can go to this computer that's showing up in my field of vision. It's like it's obvious. It's like it's here. It's it has shape and color and all that. But then when I look at really closely, well, what do I mean by shape? What do I mean by color? What do I mean by here? And all of a sudden, it starts getting as weird as when I'm looking for what's really looking at my experience. And so.
But you can have the experience of looking for the experience.
Of course.
And you can know that you're doing that.
Of course, sure.
Without labeling it in any way.
Oh yeah, you can look at the experience. You can find it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very subtle, You have to go to the most subtle portion of yourself to do it. You have to go to your true beingness, You have to go to the absolute, the divine, and then because God can see itself, God alone can see God, but it happens that God is seeing all of your experience right now anyway. So all God has to do is quit looking at your experience and look at itself, and and then it discovers that in actuality that's not anything different other than looking at your experience. Start talking about this stuff gets is entertaining. It's a good joke.
There's somebody here again, the same person, who's saying, are you suggesting that we seem to know the cause but can only speak of the symptom?
Know the cause but speak. I see what you mean. Well, yes, that's a way to put it, but it's a little subtler than that. Yes, the cause is known. Symptoms are also known. And symptoms can be spoken of more easily because language was developed specifically for the purpose of speaking about symptoms. I can talk about the symptom of this computer because we have this word computer, which is specifically designed to talk about this symptom. And it's harder to speak about the cause, it's harder to speak about, what is knowing this experience because we don't have words for it. It's not an object that we're used to indicating and pointing to. I mean, we do have words. We have words like God. We have words like Atman. We have words like, the self. We have words like the knower, But these words are vague at best. They don't give us a lot of help. But the word computer doesn't really give us a lot of help either, because when you really go into what this is, it so vastly transcends the word computer as to be, completely absurd. In exactly the same way as when you go into the knower, it completely transcends what's actually there. Completely transcends notions of the knower or the word.
As I understood the question, it seemed to be that thoughts are a result of knowing, and they're not actually connected.
Right.
I mean, except that all thoughts happen in now,
right.
or in this, but because it doesn't generate questions.
No.
That was how I understood it.
And yet knowing actually generates everything. So
it generates everything, but not
tricky.
specifically that I feel hungry or I want to go to sleep.
Right. Not immediately. Yeah. Well, it's all very tricky. You know what? I need to have a little break, so why don't we take a brief break? I'm going to shut off the broadcast for a moment, for those of you out there, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. Yeah. Let's call it the ground state, the fundamental state of being, the fundamental state of what we call experience, what we call awareness, what we call consciousness, is ultimately an extension of and an implication of this ground condition.
Yeah. Right.
In other words, everything, all the elaborations that we experience within experience show up as an outgrowth of this ground condition, exist within the ground condition, and are made of the ground condition. In other words, they're implications of the ground condition.
Right.
So it is. It is the ground condition, but it's not a simple thing. It's not certainly not an inert thing. It's
very dynamic.
It's not a thing at all.
Right.
Well, all dynamism exists within the context of it, and all stasis exists within the context of it, and so on and so forth.
It's bigger than they're all.
It's pretty much bigger than everything, you might say.
Isn't that the this you keep referring to?
Mm-hmm. It is indeed.
So just looking at that, I mean, I was working with this symbol and I was seeing if that symbol could sort of go into my unconscious, let's say.
Uh-huh.
And and then when it sort of like disappeared, and I could feel the background of whatever it disappeared into.
Right.
And then every once in a while, some thoughts would sort of appear, and I just kind of brush them away and go back to just hanging out and looking at that force.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. But again, when you do that kind of thing, be wary of taking any way that it's appearing to you, no matter how subtly, as being the final version of it.
Right. Yeah, because it could be anything, including this room.
Yeah, but so even when you're with, so like that, you're behind thought, you're in you're in kind of a ground state. It's cool, okay, but that's not actually the ground state. That's just a version of the ground state that the ground state is emanating, you might say.
Oh yeah, right. Of course, yeah.
So
yeah.
So in other words, it's kind of a turtles all the way down thing.
Yeah, right.
So when you see a turtle, doesn't mean you've hit the bottom. It just means
right. Right. Good point. Because that goes along with what you're saying about a sparkler, that it's always throwing off versions of itself.
Yeah.
So just looking at that ground state doesn't necessarily mean I'm looking at the bright point of the sparkler.
Right, exactly.
I could be seeing just a spark.
Yeah. I mean, basically, if you're seeing anything, you're not seeing the...
You're seeing a spark.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
And yet, it's all very paradoxical, because the sparks are the ground state. The ground state doesn't depart from itself.
Right, yeah.
I mean, which is the whole basis of liberation, when you discover that no phenomena departs from the Absolute. Everything exists within the Absolute, is made of the Absolute, doesn't depart from the Absolute, appears within it and disappears into it. And the Absolute, nothing is added to the Absolute in this whole process, nothing is taken away from the Absolute in this whole process, nothing is gained, nothing is lost. It's bulletproof, it's invulnerable.
Right.
It's what they call the dorje in Tibetan. It's a diamond.
Right, yeah. So even the thoughts that sort of come in and go, that's that too.
Anything, all forms.
Have to all recognize the whole thing.
Yeah.
How do you spell dorje?
Well, it's transliterated, it's not really spelled.
Okay, is it phonetic?
It's usually spelled D-O-R-J-E.
Okay.
But they put a little R in front of the D for, it's...
Yeah.
But it's transliterated, so it's not actually spelled.
Yeah.
It's like Sanskrit words, they aren't actually spelled in English, they're just transliterated.
Because the way it's said, it sounds like some sort of like door stopper.
Well, it's pronounced something vague. I'm sure dorje is a terrible pronunciation of the word, which is a translation into Tibetan of the Sanskrit word vajra, which I'm sure is a terrible mispronunciation. But they both mean diamond.
Okay.
Which refers to its absolute inviolability, its absolute, hardness, its absolute undamageability.
Right.
This state right now, this is the dorje.
This is it.
Yeah. So it might morph and change.
It can appear as anything, but it is always itself.
Yeah.
It never departs from itself. It never is added to itself. It never is subtracted from itself. It's always just this. This is it. This is the absolute condition right here.
Right.
Always. And the absolute condition is always right here. First.
Right.
I like the diamond as a metaphor, because in the prismaticness of a diamond, you could see there's any different number of viewpoints,
Sure.
and it's all just the diamond.
Yeah.
So it's not about knowing. It's about surrendering to the not knowingness of every
Yes.
moment.
Precisely.
It's not a knowing of the
No.
mind that can be said, this is it, I've got it.
No.
That'll never happen.
It's acknowledging being, the supremacy of being, and you put it surrendering to that, And yet that is the knowing.
That is the knowing.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You put your finger right on it. That's it. Well put.
What the fuck is the point with it? All this stuff, you know? Just watching. It's like watching a little beetle.
Yeah, it's funny.
Just
Yeah, I mean, another way to put it is just trusting being. I mean, or you could say discovering the obvious fact that being is trustworthy. since being, if being isn't trustworthy, we're shit out of luck.
I think we're shit out of luck. I don't know if being is trustworthy.
No, it's a poetic.
Yeah.
It's as trustworthy as you're going to find now.
It's all with God.
That's the point. Yeah. And on the other side hand, if being lets us down, who's going to know?
You can follow that one forever. I love this stuff.
It's fun.
It really is fun.
It's kind of like taking a big joint, taking a big hit.
Natural high.
Yeah.
it seems too simple. It just seems way too easy.
Gotta be harder.
Yeah, that's the immediate like. It can't be that.
That's it.
It's so simple. It can't.
That which cannot be simpler. That from which all complication comes. And in the context of which all complication exists.
suppose you could say that it creates complication, but it is not itself complicated.
Well, you can't even say that.
No.
You can say it is simple. It may be infinitely complicated, but it's simple.
There you go. That's
It's simple in the sense that everything reduces to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's simple in the sense that it's the seed.
It's an inordinate mess.
Yeah, just letting go of holding ourselves apart from being, which of course you can never actually do, except in your imagination. You can only pretend to with all these complications and bullshit that our mind spews out. You get all emotional now. It's just being. Subject, verb, and object.
I'm still back on turtles all the way down. I'm sure there must be a flaw to that logic somewhere along the line.
Well, it's not logic, that's the point.
Right.
The all the way down sounds logical.
Yeah.
Makes it sound logical, but of course...
I know it's interesting to see what my mind comes up with when I hear that. You know, I visualize a stack of turtles, one on top of the other, which of course, you know, is nothing related to what the actual statement is about.
Do you want another question from the internet?
Sure, why not?
Why does this mystery only seem to be known when it's known that it can't be?
Well, it seems to be known when it's known that it can't be, because that's its condition. If you think it can be known, you are known definitively or known in the final version, you are fantasizing, so you're not knowing it. Its actual condition is one of open-endedness, which of course cannot be known definitively except as open-endedness. So when you know that it can't be known, you're knowing it, because that's what it is, that's what it actually is, so you're knowing that. You know, it sounds like a logical convolution when you put it in language, but it happens to be the case. That there's no final version of what this actually is. There's no thing that you can get to and say, oh yeah, that's it, which could be then known as an object. So the fact that it is open-ended, the fact that it is essentially unknowable in a final version, is knowing it truly, because that's what it is.
What is knowing it truly?
Oh, it's not important. Catch it in the reruns.
Well, how does that compare with the notion of the experience of the silence?
It's one and the same. Silence is unknowable. Silence doesn't have edges or boundaries or finality. So silence is just another euphemism for the unknowable. And knowing that it's unknowable is knowing it truly. So when you say it can't be known, it's kind of like saying, this statement is not true. It gets into a logical paradox. It's irresolvable logically, but it transcends the structure of the logic to be nonetheless meaningful.
Except there seems to be, in a meaningful way,
What seems to be?
The knowing of the not being able to be known.
Yeah. It's absolutely, it's profoundly meaningful. It's the absolute of meaning. And again, it's not that it can't be known definitively. In other words, you can't say, oh yeah, it's this, period. You can't put it in a definition, you can't put it in it, you can't draw a circle around it and say, yeah, it's what's inside this circle. And yet, of course it can be known because nothing else whatsoever is known. All knowing is of it, all experiencing is of it. But there's no final version, it's infinity, it's open-endedness forever, it can look like absolutely anything. And yet you can know that fact with absolute self-verifying certainty.
It seems like
I think knowing that fact points me off. Being that fact is more maybe.
Well, you know it because you are it. It's the only way you can know it. The only way you know your own open-endedness is because you are that open-endedness. You're not looking at it from outside.
Yeah, and there's this curious jumping off point between knowing a concept, thinking of a concept of knowing unknowingness and all that,
right,
and then actually stepping into the experience of
right.
Whatever a moment of being is, yeah. And being that moment of being.
Yeah, and that stepping into is knowing. And thinking you know it conceptually is not knowing.
Right, but they're not that far apart.
Well, they're the same thing, ultimately. Because concepts are being. Concepts are not the opposite of being. They exist in being. They exist solely because of being. Being generates concepts. We sort of demonize the conceptual because of its obvious absurdity. But it's just another harmonic of being.
That's pretty trippy.
Well, another way of putting that is concepts aren't really concepts. The concept of concepts of concepts is a concept.
Mm-hmm.
I lost you at number 3. Maybe it's number 2. Or maybe it was before number 1.
It's just a concept. That's all they're saying.
No, actually, I'm saying it's not a concept.
It's not a concept.
The idea that it's just a concept is a concept, but the concept itself is not a
Isn't
concept.
one, yeah.
It's a mystery.
Well, it's kind of a concept. It's not a concept you can be with it, but it is a concept if you're not being with it as a concept.
Yeah, but not being with it as a concept is not being with it.
Wow.
It's only the words that make it so
I
baroque.
know, it's...
The ideas
But
are
the
actually
words
perfectly
is-
clear.
Perhaps you better start just giving us peacock feathers or something like that.
We have another question from
Oh, sure.
Etherland. From the reference of the unknown, is there a collective intelligence or memory to draw upon?
The unknown is the collective intelligence and is the memory, but it's not necessarily collective. It's because it has no parts to collect. It is intelligence. It is its own memory.
Would you go further and say you can't actually draw upon it?
Well, yeah. I mean, it draws upon itself.
So,
You could
yes.
say, as a sort of a circumlocution.
Yeah.
But it is itself.
It is itself, of course.
There's only one thing.
Only one thing.
Scary.
How convenient. That way, it's hard to lose.
It's 7.
It's hard to forget where you put it. Actually, it's very easy to forget where you put it, isn't it?
That's right.
Because it's everywhere.
That's the usual thing. I've been an expert at it most of my life. Getting back to this not knowing,
Yeah.
that threw me for a loop. I didn't follow that.
Which particular no. Come up with your
I
own,
would-
instead of going back to some previous version, come up with your own version. What version is it that
It's just completely confused that ever loving beat Jesus out of me. I don't know if I could
well,
reformulate it.
it's confusing because the idea of not knowing is an untruth. There's no such thing. And the idea of concepts is untrue because there's no such thing. There's this, and the very nature of this is a knowing, and the very nature of this is non-conceptual. And of course, when what we call concepts appear, they aren't really concepts, they're really this.
Well, when I'm in that, everything's good. But then mentality starts to brew in there,
Right.
trying to make sense and this and that, and then
You get confused by thinking that the mentality is concepts and thinking they're about something. But that's a fallacy. Concepts are not about anything, and they aren't concepts. When you see that fact nakedly, then the concepts don't confuse you anymore. In other words, when you're thinking, you're not really thinking. You can't say what's actually happening. But it's exactly the same thing that you can't. It's exactly the same thing as everything else that you can't say what's actually happening. So you can say I'm seeing light, but you're not actually seeing it. It's not light. You can't say what's actually happening. You can say you're hearing a discussion, but it's not actually a discussion. You're not actually hearing it. You can't say what's actually happening. You can say I'm thinking, but it's not really thinking, and it's not really you doing it. You can't say what's actually happening. On that level, concepts aren't confusing at all.
the part of me that's on that level has got no problem.
Well, screw the rest of you. That's exactly the point. Is be aware of the part of you that's on that lives there, that is doing that. You can be aware of it because it's there always, and it is accessible. You can access the trance personally. You can access the trance. We were talking about it earlier as being sort of trance incarnational or trance, above the body or something. In fact, that might be a nice quick definition of realization, is to be aware of that part of yourself, become aware directly of that part of yourself that is not generated as a body function and is independent of the body. Which sounds really spooky and hoity-toity in capital letters and mystical and all that, but it's really very simple, because if you become very sensitive to your experience, you'll discover parts of it that don't have the characteristics of physical functioning.
I've experienced those, and it's just, for lack of a better term, just habitually, I haven't focused on those.
Exactly. So the only problem is your habit, but it's possible to go there, so to speak, anytime, because it's right here, right where it is. And you can maybe rehabituate yourself if you want to.
What I've been noticing is that all my activities are coming out of that unknown place anyway.
Yeah, totally.
It's just...
It's already a done deal.
It's a done deal. I mean, just seeing that that's actually the case, that it's not my mind thinking up anything.
It's that simple. Yeah.
I mean, it's already happening.
Right.
You're already living there.
Yeah.
But your mind's telling you, no, you're a reduced form of that, or you're a known form of that, or something.
Exactly so.
But that's the habituation.
Right. But it doesn't mean anything. It's not true. You can say you're not that, doesn't make it the case. Because even what's saying it is that, so it gives a lie to the claim.
I mean, your mind's totally trying to make things tidy all the time.
Yeah. It's trying to create a coherent version of things in its terms.
Right.
Which it can't be done.
No, it's impossible.
You can't grab this beauty, this open-endedness in ideas.
Right. But it's funny because it's hard to identify what you are also. You don't know.
Well, it's impossible to identify as to designate it, to define it.
Right.
But it's easy to know it.
Yeah.
And which is all you need to do. You don't need to define it. Mm-hmm. When you know it, you have it, you are it, so who cares about the definition?
Yeah, right.
You're not in the business of defining.
Yeah, true.
You don't need to be anyway.
Yeah. For sure.
Do yourself a favor.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not located anywhere. It doesn't have any. It's got its own kind of life in it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's not in space.
Right.
It's right here, but it's not in space. It's right here, but it's not in time.
Yeah.
It's doing itself. It's incredibly intelligent. I mean, humans are stupid. Peter Brown's an idiot. Peter Brown is just stupid. When he thinks it's just drivel. This pathetic drivel, and yet there's this astounding intelligence that's here too.
Right.
And that's what I am. Peter Brown is just a wort on that.
Yeah, right. Well, so it's funny because
a strange growth.
Strange growth, right?
It's sort of like where the hair is on the divine's head.
Sure. Yeah. Sure.
Little out.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think like, well, what'll it come up with next?
And what good does it do you?
You have a question here that's a leftover. It's a continuation of something you said on Saturday.
Uh-huh.
You sort of deny the simplicity of being. My experience is, this is the person, my experience is that every moment, when not lost in thought, is simple, not knowable, but simple. Yes or no?
Sure, you can say that. But again, does simplicity really define it? It is exactly what it is. And it can't be said what that is. And if you want to call it simplicity, you can. If you want to call it peace, you can. If you want to call it quiet, you can. You want to call it harmony, you can. But do any of those notions really inclusively capture it? And they don't, because they're partial notions, and this is absolutely no partiality. So I mean, to address the question, by all means, simple, sure, that's a fine way to put it. But don't stop at the simple, stop at the it, stop at what it is, not at the designation. If that's a meaningful designation for you, then that's absolutely fine, of course.
But ultimately, you always have to stop before the designation.
Yeah. Right.
I find that I have to work to get at that non-conceptual place.
I mean, and again, we're challenged by our own habits. If you're used to going to a conceptual mode, then you tend to go there. But there's tricks, because again, even the conceptual mode is actually not really conceptual. So you can definitely go to a non-conceptual mode, or go to a conceptual mode and see the background, which is always there, concurrently. Or you can go to the conceptual mode and look at the conceptual mode with great precision and see what it actually is, and you'll discover that it's non-conceptually present. It's a radiant presence of being. So that's the sense in which even conceptual is non-conceptual, because it's radiant present.
Self-destructs.
Yeah, it self-destructs. It's the same doctrine, it self-liberates. Because it happens to be the Dharma kind. Not important. Technical term.
We were talking earlier on about silence.
Mm-hmm.
I'm unclear on how silence is a mechanism for teaching. It's serendipitous, and anything can happen.
Mm-hmm.
But whatever awareness I have, I got from whatever it was that you said to me that made that happen. And if I'd been sitting in silence with you, that wouldn't have happened.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, silence is like I might get it from driving a car or walking across the street just as easily.
Mm-hmm.
But listening to somebody who has that awareness describe it in the best ways they can seems to me more likely to bring results.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you, so you can probably judge from my behavior. But, having said that, there's nothing whatsoever that can't be a viable teaching mode. A viable mode of access. And different people, what's valuable and effective for one person may not work at all for another person, and vice versa. So, you can't really say anything definitive about it, I guess.
No, there's obviously.
So yeah, but anything's viable. There's no laws. There's no rules. I mean, I like from my teacher, for Pino, I got it. From sitting around drinking bullshitting. He never explained anything to me, except very obliquely in the course of his stories. He would mention about certain psychic phenomena he'd experienced or something, and it was all just sort of tall tales and drinking, and yet I realized as a result of that.
But you were telling earlier on that he described isness, or I can't remember the exact word.
But he didn't describe it.
But he would use it.
Well, he didn't even point it out. He just used it in the course of his talking. I mean, it was very oblique. It was there, but that's the point. Really, is that a realized person, everything they do it's there in it. It's encoded. It's embedded in it. So a realized person can use any vehicle whatsoever, effectively, at least theoretically, depending upon the receptivity of the person they're working with.
But there do seem to be more effective ways than others. I mean,
I think so too. But
a realized bullfighter might not actually be a very good teacher if he's teaching through bullfighting.
Might not, and people might not know, because you might have a method that a realized person might be using a method that people misinterpret. That it's like chanting. It's like your guy we were talking about. Chanting and getting all blissed out and ecstatic, and you can think, oh yeah, that's it, I'm getting it, Whereas you aren't really, you're just, may or may not be, but you're missing the point by getting caught up in the vehicle. And this is always, for me personally, this is my, as a challenge as teaching, is to try to be as open-ended, to try to approximate the open-endedness of what we're approaching with the way we're approaching it. So rather than narrowing it down to, approach it this way, let's all chant now. Let's all chant. Let's chant every day. Let's chant. So that's narrowing it. It's like, okay, that's fine, but what are you doing? How about when you're not chanting? Or let's talk about it and discuss it. How about when you're not talking about it and discussing? You know, let's be serious. Okay, how about when you're not serious? You know, let's joke. Okay, how about when you're not joking? You know, so what this is infinitely open-ended. It's infinitely not anything in particular, and yet in talking and addressing these things, we perforce use things that imply particularities, and so to try to use particularities and yet keep them from collapsing on themselves into particularness is I would say is my personal challenge. But again, that's the way I work, and who knows whether that even is relevant? Who gives a shit? I mean, maybe something else would be fine.
Have you ever tried bullfighting?
I can't say I have. Actually, I can't say I have.
Peter would immediately say that the mind doing what it's doing is just a resonance of what is, and it's all the same thing.
Yeah.
But I think people like silence as a tool because it isn't the incessant inner banter.
Mm-hmm.
It gets completely. So whatever I find, like an Eckhart Tolle or somebody like that, would immediately make me realize is that there's always a silence that's aware of the sounds of the mind, for example, the sounds of anything. That always helps me to have some sort of that ground we were talking about.
Sure.
Because typically for somebody like me, it's the mind that maybe somebody else has a different experience, like of what it is that is telling them it's not it or whatever. For me, it's the mind. It's too easy. Who the hell are you to say that? You really come on, buddy. Like it's just very antagonistic with me. But I nowadays I can always go like, that's true. It's still just there's still the naked awareness, no matter what the mind's doing. It's like it could be in drag. It could say I'm Batman. It's no different from I'm enlightened or
Sure.
you're not enlightened.
Yeah.
That's why it makes sense to me. But but he appeals to my mind too, because I love intellectuality and I love philosophy, and I think it's beautiful. That it's kind of a funny.
Well, part of what I do is also rather specific, because it's again the mind is usually the problem for most people, and it's easy to polarize that. The mind's the problem, the solution is not the mind. Which simplistically and immediately as a tactic can be very powerful, like, go to the silence beyond the mind, go to the awareness, blah, blah, blah. But then what do you do about the mind? So, which is why I like to incorporate the mind and go through it and show that even the mind is not the enemy, the mind is not a problem, the mind is not a brick wall. The mind itself is the silence. And that way you're bulletproof, because your most vicious foe proves to be your ally, rather than having a sort of a truce where the mind's annoying, it's a problem, but I can go to the silence anytime I want. That's great, but then the mind comes back up, and whereas if you go through the mind and find out that it's not a problem, you've vanquished it. But it's a matter. It's all, and all this discussion is actually pretty trivial, because this whole process, so to speak, of unfoldment does itself in its own way individually anyway. So talking about techniques and tactics and all this stuff is really pretty silly, because whatever you throw out there, it's kind of like throwing out garbage into a field, and the birds will come down and they'll pick whatever they can use. So it doesn't matter what it is.
So we're crows?
Well, it's a loose metaphor.
Or loons.
Maybe seagulls.
I was actually thinking of those bowerbirds that pick up shiny objects and put them around their nest to try to attract
So you got a really fancy tail. We've got a question from before on the internet here,
Uh-huh.
which is, are you suggesting that in order to see what something is, one must also see what something isn't at the same instant?
Well, you don't have to do that specifically, but when you see what something is, you will discover it is infinitely more than what it is in terms of specifics, and it will turn out to also include what it isn't, because things are not to be have exclusive identity. The identity of anything is actually the identity of everything. All of which sounds very sort of philosophical and abstract, but experientially, this is the case. So whatever presents itself, you don't need to construct, okay, I'm looking at this, so let me look at what it isn't so I can include it. Just look at what it really is, and really see it, and what you see will open up until it's inclusive, rather than being a simple, limited condition or quality within your experience. So the short answer is yes, but it's not something you need to do. It does itself just by seeing. And it's all about seeing. Just see. Look at your experience and see what's really there, and your mind will be blown, because what's really there is inconceivable. Wherever you look, doesn't matter what you're looking at. Look at physical, look at sensory experience, look at mental experience, look at transpersonal experience, look at anything. It's all just inconceivably astounding. Inconceivably astounding. Absolutely beyond description. Absolutely miraculous. And it's self-evident that that's the case. And so this is discoverable. So just need to look. We just need to look. Seek and you will find. A great man supposedly once said. There's a quotation for it, see?
Knock and it shall be open.
Perhaps could be said, seek and you are found, rather than you will find.
Absolutely. Well, it's a translation of a translation of a translation, so who knows what he actually said, if anything.
Peter?
Yeah.
Would you say that the mind is the gross attribute of intelligence?
Yes.
Question number one, and then number two is, in the awakened state, does the mind get more refined?
It does. It's not that the mind gets more refined, but since the mind is an outgrowth of the inherent intelligence already is refined, and the mind is just like a shadow of it or an aspect of it.
Because I mean, I notice that at least my mind gets really, really gross at times, and it's like I'm seeing all of this happening and wondering. It's just not refined. It's just real gross and uncomfortable and.
Right. Well, one aspect of what you're asking is that when the mind feeds back on itself, like when you have these sort of coarse thoughts and then coarse reactions to the coarse thoughts, and it gets in a whirlpool of coarseness. The coarseness feeds itself, and there's nothing else there. But when you experience the mind as an outgrowth of the inherent intelligence, then that coarseness doesn't tend to resonate and feed on itself so much. It's just there, like a shadow is there in the light, and so it's not emphasized. It's not like it's I don't know how it's not feeding back on itself, you might say. So it doesn't necessarily get refined, but it may seem to be much more refined just because refinement is there, and the coarseness is not, taking center stage, you might say.
So it goes with spiritual maturity then, where you see the mind as an outgrowth of the intelligence.
Yeah, because we have more and more direct experience of the actual intelligence, which is divine, which is everything of great beauty and purity, and our coarse thoughts, so-called, are literally an outgrowth of that. So they aren't actually coarse. They're only coarse because they're taken out of context. When you experience conscious mind as conscious mind and not in any context, it's a horrible thing. it's discordant, it's rude, it's crude, it's heavy-handed, right?
Yeah.
But seeing it out of context is not really true, because it's actually always in context. I mean, as you become more sensitive, become aware of the context of the more refined intelligence, which is actually always there, and which is actually doing the conscious mind, then you become aware of that refinement as a part of the process, and you're no longer just locked into the sort of heavy-handedness. It's kind of like, pulling back the shades and letting the light in or something, maybe. And all of this is a really, I think it's a really important point, because again, typically we experience the mind as our problem, spiritually, psychologically. Our thoughts are going on, and they're annoying, and they're, controlling us, and just the whole thing is just it's an awful kind of an experience, and we can't see any way out of it. So it's easy to think the mind's the problem, and then it's easy to create an opposite that is the solution, and then but you still have the mind as kind of the enemy of the problem. But when you discover the mind doesn't actually operate in a vacuum, and the mind as a problem is actually an expression of a system, a wholeness, which is actually the solution. So the mind is a part of the solution. It's not a problem that's polarized, opposite, opposed to the solution. So, and when we discover this, the inherent intelligence, when we discover this amazing, radiant being that we actually are, that all this actually is, then we see the mind is a direct outgrowth, a direct functioning of that, and the mind is actually a pure thing. It's a beautiful thing. But it's not understood that way, and it's not seen in its proper context when we are ignorant of that context. But this is doable, this is knowable. We can become more and more aware of, more sensitive to this amazing beingness that we are. And as we do so, we see the connectedness, we see the mind is an outgrowth of that, and our beings and all of our functioning is an outgrowth of that. And it becomes sacred, not because it changes so much, as because we discover that what it is an expression of that which is sacred, inherently.
We have a question here.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to get him to withdraw it, but he wouldn't.
Okay.
Would you agree with him that the ignorance of all knowledge is that it contains no real intelligence?
Well, that's a simplification. Ignorance is ignorance to the extent it contains no intelligence, but since ignorance actually does contain intelligence, it's not really ignorant. Ignorance, spiritually speaking, ignorance is the vehicle through which intelligence discovers itself. Separation is the vehicle through which wholeness discovers itself. Suffering is the vehicle through which release and completeness discovers itself. So suffering and ignorance and partiality and all these things actually contain the wholeness and the intelligence that ultimately they are the vehicles of. So in other words, it's not that what you're saying is not interesting and doesn't have some points to it. It's just a vast oversimplification of something which is much more subtle.
It's a little bit of stuff the guru going on tonight.
Stop the guru. That's easy. And again, our challenge is not to come up with more sophisticated and accurate ways of putting things, so much as our challenge is to see what this actually is, which is irrespective of how we put it. The way we put things doesn't change what they really are, so it doesn't really matter what we're calling things or how we're designating things. The challenge is to see what they actually are, which of course is non-conceptual. It's not subject to our words and ideas and definitions. It is what it is, whatever we call it. So you can call it ignorance, you can call it intelligence, you can call it anything you want. It doesn't change the fact. Sticks and stones and all that kind of thing. The actual condition is not affected by what we think of it or what we call it. And so our challenge is just simply to see what that is, see what this beingness is. Not to worry about what we're going to call it. I'm investigating reality, but I'm really concerned about what the title of the book is I'm going to write about it. It's sort of the cart before the horse,
See, Peter, it seems like the beingness is so far ahead of the thinkingness.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that thinking is kind of like, it almost feels like it's happening in a parallel universe and it doesn't really apply. I mean...
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, it's very... You can say that. It's almost... It's the subtlety and inconceivability of the intelligence versus the conscious thought is, just inconceivably different.
Right.
And yet, of course, they're actually the same thing.
Right. Yeah, they're the same thing. Right.
But first, as we discovered this, the revelation is, wow, this is how different it is, how amazing it is, how perfect it is, how infinite it is, how because we discovered the divine, and oh my God, what can you say, right?
Right.
Literally. But then, as we get more, compared to our human functioning, we look down, it looks like a little clod. It's pathetic. But then, as we get more wise and more integrated, we discover that, well, in actuality, it's an outgrowth of that, and so they aren't actually polarized and as opposite as they at first seem to be.
Mm-hmm.
But the range is vast.
Yeah.
The astounding intelligence and functionality of reality is inconceivable from a human point of view.
Right.
So,
And that's a done deal. That's already, it's happening, and it always has been happening, and that's...
Yeah, we just need to become aware of it.
Yeah.
We notice it, which is doable because it's right here. It's just so fine, it's so subtle and so fine, typically when we're lost in ignorance, we can't believe it. Because we're actually experiencing it all the time. But it's like the stars in the sky. They're there, but you don't spend much time thinking about them, right? Because what's it have to do with my life? And we'd like that, when I'm thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner, when I'm going to bed, what book I'm going to read, is what matters. And this amazing radiance is like, well, what's it have to do with me? Because I'm all caught up in this, these details of my life and what I want and what I'm going to do. But when it just finally penetrates through our sloppy karma, that wait a minute, there's something going on here. This radiance isn't just up there. It actually is all one thing. All of a sudden, whoa! It starts getting very interesting and very upsetting.
Yeah, it sort of feels like the mind gives you up or something.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like it's tired and says, "Oh yeah, I can't really do this.
Yeah.
I can't really keep kind of an ongoing play-by-play thing about what's happening here because I can't. It can't do that."
Yeah. And there's nothing to gain by it.
Yeah.
And it's all fiction anyway.
Yeah, right.
Our descriptions of what's going on are completely erroneous, so why put so much energy and investment into them?
Right, really.
But there's also a sharpening. I mean, this may relate to what we were talking. I mean, I don't know how it's for you. Probably not sharper than for me. But it seems the more I engage in that appreciation, if you will, or the awareness of the oneness, and the very real fact that I am at least I come from those stars, can't come from anything else, and they come from where everything else comes from, and we're all, it's just the one thing happening. The mind can get sharper.
Yeah, sure.
It's not necessarily that it can explain everything, but in not having to explain everything, that's sort of it's quick. It's like, it's quicker to the point. It doesn't waste as much time.
Right.
Like, it doesn't have to check and double check and triple check or outside references for everything. It can just...
Yeah, because it's drawing on the inherent intelligence more efficiently, rather than just drawing on its own circular logic.
Right.
So you don't need to go looking things up in dictionaries and finding, authorities, before you say anything, kind of thing. There's a knowing, there's a speed, your intelligence becomes much more edgy, for sure, much sharper, more precise. Yeah, for sure. The more we incorporate these inconceivable flows of energy, let's call it, that we are, and the less we're holding them apart and standing apart from them, the more our function becomes inconceivably more efficient and spontaneous and inspired, and we get edgy. We're right on more and more on the sharp cutting edge of our life, rather than sort of being in a fog and being
It seems like that, even down to small things like doing yard work or something.
Totally.
You're just automatically doing what has to be done next, even if it's complex,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, intelligence meets the situation.
Right.
More and more directly, and so there's no need for mediation of figuring things out or thinking about things, or it's just
cooking too. I mean, everything.
Yeah,
everything is.
Well, and that's why it's good to do those other things, is because then we have that energetic experience. Or for me, I find that, like going places, doing things, I actually get to have experience rather than sit and think about it.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, in alchemy, a big part of making the philosopher's stone is what they call proving the stone, which means you have to take the philosopher's stone and take it out and make gold with it. And the point wasn't to make gold. The point was that making the gold proved that the philosopher's stone was a real thing. And this is analogous. In fact, it refers very directly to what we're talking about, is that expressing, engaging in activity is a vehicle for enlightenment to manifest itself, because it proves itself, it shows itself, it reveals itself in this directness, this efficiency, this reality. Dragging in alchemy is always a conversation stopper, I've noticed. little too archaic a reference.
I'll have to bring you the story of the Master of the Blue Cape. Have you read Manly P. Hall's book, The Ways of the Lonely Ones? There's some very good stories in there about the alchemist.
Yeah, I bet, yeah.
I'm not against alchemy.
That's what we're doing here, so you'd be a fool to be.
It really is alchemy.
Well, this is it.
This is it, yeah.
This is alchemy. Alchemy it's fascinating actually to study it. It's very difficult to study because there's very few people that truly understood what it was. But if you are, at least semi-realized and look into all the evidence of the alchemical information, you can see for yourself what it is, which is a very heavily veiled and sort of mythologized version of this discovery of integration with reality. And they used very heavy symbolism to refer to things, because back in those days, this was in the days of the Inquisition, and the Catholic Church ran everything and all of that. So you didn't want to be talking about these things too overtly. So basically alchemy was a very elaborate system of code that enabled people who were investigating this kind of thing to talk with each other and publish books to communicate with each other indirectly that would not be actionable. But the subject matter of what the alchemy was about, in the cases of genuine alchemy, of course, because it was such a heavily veiled code, a lot of people used the code not having any idea what it was talking about. They thought it was about making gold.
That's why the church tolerated it.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
They wanted the gold.
Bring more gold coins to the plate.
Yeah. It was exactly about discovering reality within the context of unreality.
Which is no different from the Upanishads or the Bible or the...
Not different at all.
Mm.
Not different at all. Just different, you get different metaphors, context. Different emphases, so on and so forth. The alchemy is interesting because it was very technical and very specifically yogic oriented, so they were looking at actual specific qualities as opposed to being more vaguely religious and speaking in more general terms. So a lot of the symbols they used referred to more or less specific aspects of experience and so on and so forth. So they were very analytical. And the process generated a lot of really fascinating gobbledygook.
To throw the real seeker off the path.
Well, to throw the false seeker off, the real seeker could find it, could figure it out. Because the inherent intelligence could penetrate the code. So if you were a human being trying to make sense of it, you're screwed. But if you were seeing with your third eye, so to speak, you could actually see what it was about, see the symmetry of it. The third eye is another good example of the symbolism, because the two eyes are the physical eyes, and the third eye is the eye that experiences experience. So it's the inherent intelligence.
It's very different than the mind's eye of imagination.
Very different.
Here's what I had thought that it meant.
No. That's still the two eyes. Because not physically, but in the sense that imagination is taking the actual energy, the real noumenal energy, and transposing it into supposed forms. Like if you're imagining something, you're creating a something out of what's actually not that something. And the third eye is what sees what's really there, not turning it into something, which is what imagination does. Now, imagination, you want to say, takes the Shakti and turns it into a world, a fantasy, a creation. Whereas the third eye is that which sees the Shakti itself. Getting esoteric tonight.
Perhaps that's what will happen from here on in. He'll just become more and more esoteric.
Alchemy, the third eye. Oh my God. Attendantship will drop down to.
So let's start talking about.
He's really lost it now.
So no, we're just
He was obscure before, but now, good God.
Maybe we should start talking about LSD and marijuana and things to draw in the crowd. Or tennis or something.
Start chanting.
cooking,
I'll start chanting.
cooking classes.
Well, anyway, it's about quitting time, so I'm going to shut down. Good night online.